Have you ever wondered what it feels like to be left alone in the dark? Waiting for someone who never returns. Picture a little girl, barefoot and trembling, carrying her newborn brother through the cold prairie night. She knocks on the door of a stranger, a hardened rancher, a man used to silence, not to the cries of children. In that moment, two lives collide. What would you do if you were in his place? Would you turn them away, clinging to your solitude, or open your door to a future you never planned for? And if you were that child, would you dare to trust a stranger's firelight, hoping it might save you? This is not just a story about survival. It is about choices, about mercy when the world whispers shame, about the way one act of kindness can change the course of many lives. As you listen, imagine yourself on that prairie porch. Which choice would you have made? Stay with us, because what begins as a single knock soon becomes a journey of trust, forgiveness, and the making of a family. Please like, share, and subscribe so you never miss the stories that touch the heart. The lantern on Caleb Whitlock's table flickered weakly, its flame fighting the hush of midnight. Beyond the walls, Highwind Prairie stretched endless and still, the wind dragging whispers across the tall grass. Caleb's rough hands moved steadily over a strip of leather he was mending when a knock sounded against a wooden door. It was no bold rap from a hired hand, nor the sharp call of a neighbor. This sound was hesitant, uneven, as if from someone unsure of their strength. Caleb frowned, rose from his chair, and crossed the creaking boards. When he swung the door open, moonlight spilled across the porch and silvered the dirt at his boots. A small figure stood there, a girl, barefoot, dressum worn thin, hair tangled by the night wind. In her arms she clutched a bundle of cloth, held close with stubborn resolve. From within came a thin whimper, the weak cry of a newborn. The child's face was ruddy, lips seeking, no more than a week old. The girl's dark eyes met his. Her voice wavered but did not break. "Mama never came back last night. We're alone. My brother's hungry." Something deep in Caleb shifted at her words, an ache he had long kept quiet. He bent nearer, studying the swaddled infant. For a moment he said nothing, only stepped aside and gestured them in. She hesitated, toes curling against the threshold, but finally crossed into the cabin. The door closed with a sigh behind them, shutting out the restless prairie. The room smelled of smoke, leather, and beans simmered earlier in the evening. Caleb set bread on a plate, poured milk into a tin cup, warming it with a splash from the kettle. The girl sat stiffly, still holding her brother, nibbling crumbs like a sparrow. Her gaze followed his every move, as though she expected the hard hand of the world to fall again. He softened his voice. "What's your name?" Her chin lifted in stubborn defiance. Mama said not to tell strangers. Caleb's mouth tugged at one corner, almost a smile. Fair enough. The baby whimpered louder, fists pushing against the cloth. Caleb had raised stock and buried kin, but this tiny creature was new country. He dipped a strip of clean cloth into the milk and held it out. The girl guided it to her brother's lips, relief flooding her face when the child latched and sucked greedily. The fire snapped in the hearth. The newborn quieted. Caleb returned to his chair, folding his hands, watching them. Long had he lived with silence, but now it was broken by fragile breaths that demanded to be heard. "Where's your place?" he asked. The girl's lips trembled. "Other side of Dry Creek, but I waited. She never came back. I walked until I saw your light." He did not ask further. Caleb had known enough sorrow not to force its shape from a child's tongue. Instead, he fetched an old quilt from his trunk, draped it over her small shoulders. She stiffened, then softened, holding it as if it were armor. The baby sighed, heavy with milk, and drifted into sleep. Caleb spoke low, almost reverent, as though the night itself were listening. "This is your home now, little one, until the Lord writes us a new page." Her eyes filled though she fought the tears. She pressed her cheek against her brother's brow, silent but listening. Scripture echoed in Caleb's memory. Words a preacher once thundered to the sky at a graveside: defend the fatherless, plead for the widow. Those words returned now, not as thunder, but as a quiet command. The girl's lashes fluttered closed. The baby's breath came shallow but steady. The quilt wrapped them both like a cocoon. Caleb trimmed the lantern wick, steadying the light. For the first time in years, the cabin felt less hollow, yet the question pressed sharp as a spur if their mother never returned. Was he now guardian, father, stranger turned kin? He leaned against the table, calloused hands curled, while the children slept trust in a man they did not know. Outside, coyotes called. The wind pressed against Whitlock cabin. Morning light found him half expecting the old silence. Instead, he heard a faint humming by the hearth. The girl sat close to the embers, quilt still around her shoulders. Jonah Lee nestled in her lap. She had fed the fire through the night with twigs, keeping the warmth alive. Caleb paused in the doorway, watching. The prairie sun crept through the shutters, painting the floor in gold lines. Life had shifted, and nothing would return to the way it had been. Caleb Whitlock paused in the doorway, his eyes resting on the small figure crouched near the hearth. Lydia Mae rocked slowly, the worn quilt still draped across her shoulders. Jonah Lee nestled in her lap. Her voice rose and fell in a tune too soft to name. Some scrap of melody she must have gathered from her mother before life had shifted. Caleb stood still, watching the girl hum to the fire as though the simple act could keep the darkness at bay. When she noticed him, her eyes lifted, wary yet steady. He said nothing, only splashed water over his face from the bucket, the cold biting him awake. The quiet stretched until Jonah Lee let out a fretful cry. Caleb crossed the room, warming milk as best he knew how, dipping a strip of cloth and pressing it gently to the baby's lips. The infant settled quickly. A faint curve touched Lydia's mouth, almost a smile, as though surprised he knew the trick at all. They ate in silence. Bread softened in broth. Lydia chewed slowly, cautious, as though food was something that could vanish if she moved too quickly. Caleb nudged more toward her, his voice low. "You will need strength." Color rose in her cheeks, but she obeyed, taking another bite without protest. The days shaped themselves into rough rhythm. Caleb worked the land, mending fences, tending his stock, splitting wood, while Lydia shadowed him with Jonah Lee always in her arms. Sometimes she trailed across the yard barefoot, wobbling yet determined. Her little brother pressed close against her side. Caleb tried once to tell her she did not need to follow, but her stubborn gaze silenced him. She continued, and he found he did not mind the company. Neighbors began to notice. One afternoon, Harlan Pike reined in at the fence, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. He squinted toward Lydia where she bent near the chicken coop. "Heard tell you have taken in strays," he said, his tone half mocking. Caleb straightened. hat pulled low against the sun. "Not strays," he answered. Pike gave a dry laugh. "Children without a mother. Call it what it is. You will ruin yourself playing nurse." Caleb's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "Feels less like a burden and more like a blessing I did not expect." Harlan muttered something about foolishness and rode on. Lydia had overheard, her shoulders stiff, her gaze on the ground. "That evening by the fire," she whispered, "are we truly blessings?" Caleb laid aside his knife, met her eyes squarely. "A house without laughter is empty. You have filled mine." She breathed deep, as though some unseen weight had lifted from her chest. That night, her humming carried louder, Jonah Lee cooing as though to second the truth of it. Still, it was not seamless. Caleb's hands, trained for rope and reins, fumbled with swaddles. Jonah often cried through the dark hours, and once in weariness Caleb muttered a curse. The sharpness startled Lydia. She clutched her brother tight, fear flashing across her small face. Regret cut Caleb deep. He crouched to her level, his voice raw. "I will not let anger touch you." His halting words steadied her, trembling, and she loosened her hold. As weeks passed, Lydia began to test the edges of her new world. She traced her finger over the spines of Caleb's books, lingered on the worn Bible, asked questions about the faded sketches in its margins. Caleb answered as best he could, his voice plain, without the polish of a preacher. At the table, she grew bolder, speaking of memories how her mother once braided her hair, how Jonah smelled of wildflowers after a wash in the creek, but of the night her mother left. She never spoke, and Caleb never asked. Trust revealed itself not only in words but in action. Lydia began to leave Jonah in his arms for short moments, darting outside to gather eggs or fetch kindling. At first she lingered in the doorway, fear sharp in her eyes, but each time she returned, she found him steady, rocking the infant with patience he had not known he carried. Slowly, that fear receded. One evening, as the sky burned in red and purple, Lydia leaned against the porch post with Jonah asleep in her arms. Caleb sat beside her, boots dusty, hat low against the fading sun. Without looking at him, she whispered, "You are not like other men." He offered no answer, only kept his eyes on the horizon. Yet the words lodged deep, stirring something long buried. Sunday brought its own trials. Caleb hitched the wagon and drove them into Dry Creek, pulling up before Dry Creek Chapel. Whispers followed them up the steps, sharp as briars. Martha Kettle clicked her tongue. Another woman murmured, "Shameful, parading bastards." Lydia's small hand slipped into his, urgent. Caleb let it rest there, firm and steady. Reverend Josiah Boone's sermon filled the rafters. "The merciful shall obtain mercy." Caleb listened, the words settling into him as Lydia's fingers tightened around his hand. He thought mercy was not some distant idea, but something tangible, seated right beside him in a worn dress with bare feet swinging above the floor. After service, the whispers grew. Some faces showed pity, others suspicion. Caleb answered none of it. Lydia lifted her head higher, shoulders squared. In her gaze flickered the first fragile trust, not yet strong, but growing. That night, when they returned to Whitlock cabin, she placed Jonah into Caleb's arms without being asked. He rocked the child slowly, the fire painting his face in warm gold. Lydia watched him for a long moment, her lips parting as though she wished to speak. But at last she laid her head on the table and drifted into sleep, the faintest smile softening her features. Caleb studied the newborn in his arms, then the girl slumped in weariness and felt the weight of choice settle heavy upon him. He had opened his door for one night, but each passing day stitched them deeper into the fabric of his life. He whispered into the quiet room, answering a question none had spoken. If their mother does not return, I reckon I already know my choice. The fire cracked. Jonah stirred, a soft sound in the stillness. Lydia sighed in her sleep, clutching the quilt tighter. Caleb stared into the shadows, realizing the decision might come sooner than he was ready. The days lengthened into weeks. Caleb worked the ranch, Lydia humming while she shadowed his steps. Jonah swaddled close. They carried a rhythm now, rough but steady, the sound of small voices filling what had once been an empty house. The Highwind Prairie stretched wide around them, winds dragging through the grass. But inside Whitlock cabin, the silence had changed. It no longer pressed heavy, it pulsed with life. One morning, Caleb found Lydia in the yard. Her small figure bent over a jar she had filled with wildflowers, setting it carefully on the porch rail. She glanced up shyly when she saw him, half ready for scolding, but he said nothing. He left the flowers where they stood. That evening he found smooth stones lined on the rail as well, offerings from her small hand, and again he let them be. The house had begun to answer to her presence. When the sun dipped and coyotes sang across the prairie, Caleb leaned on the porch post. Lydia came to stand beside him, Jonah against her shoulder. She whispered again, softer this time. You are not like other men. Caleb turned slightly. How so? She searched for words larger than her years. Other men, they do not see us, but you do. He had no reply. Words seemed too slight for the truth of what she had spoken. Instead, he opened the cabin door for her, the firelight spilling across her face. A child's voice had told him something sharper than any sermon. Inside, the jar of wildflowers glowed in the dim light. The house smelled of stew simmering low, and Caleb knew the fabric of his life had been rewoven, thread by thread, by the stubborn faith of a little girl and the breath of a newborn who had claimed a place at his table. The weeks rolled forward, each day drawing tighter threads between Caleb Whitlock and the two children who had arrived at his door in the hush of night. Lydia Mae no longer startled at every creak of the floorboards. She no longer clutched Jonah Lee quite so fiercely when Caleb reached to hold the child. Instead, she placed her baby brother in his arms with a steady look, measuring trust with eyes too old for her age. Caleb carried Jonah as he might handle a skittish colt, slow, deliberate, never rushing. His hands, calloused from reins and tools, softened when they cradled the infant. Lydia often hummed beside him as he worked, her thin voice carrying a warmth that threaded itself into the rhythm of life at Whitlock cabin. Wildflowers began to appear in jars on the table, smooth stones lined neatly on the porch rail. Caleb said nothing, but he left them where she had set them, silent acknowledgments of her quiet claim upon the home. One evening, as dusk spilled across Highwind Prairie, Lydia walked beside him from the barn, Jonah sleeping in her arms. Her small hand brushed against his, not quite grasping, but close enough to feel the heat of another. Her whisper was almost lost in the twilight. You are not like other men. Caleb turned his head slightly. How so? She frowned, searching for words larger than her years. Other men, they do not see us, but you do. Caleb did not answer. Words seemed too thin for what she had said. He only opened the cabin door, firelight spilling across her weary face, and thought how a child could speak a truth sharper than any sermon. At Dry Creek Chapel the following Sunday, Reverend Josiah Boone's voice rang through the rafters, "Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy." Caleb let the words sink into his chest while Lydia leaned her head against his sleeve. He began to wonder if mercy was not some lofty gift from heaven, but something built in kitchens and barns, around tables where bread was shared and children dared to rest their trust in calloused hands. Outside, however, whispers clustered like crows. A woman's sharp voice cut the air. Why has their mother not returned? If she cared, she would be here. Others muttered about shame, about abandonment, about sin that left scars too deep to hide. Caleb said nothing, but Lydia heard every word. That night she lay rigid beside the hearth, her small arm curled tight around Jonah Lee. Caleb sat nearby, carving wood with slow strokes. His voice broke the silence gently. Voices do not always tell truth. Little one. Sometimes they only echo fear. She turned her face toward him. In that moment, something fragile stretched between them. A bridge built not of planks, but of trust. Rumors drifted across Dry Creek like dust on the wind. Someone said the children's mother still lived. Eveline Mae, widowed before Jonah's birth, had been seen in Willow Bend, worn down, thin, barely able to stand. Caleb carried those words heavy in his chest, like stones that refused to be set down. One gray morning he saddled his horse and rode out, following the trail of gossip until he found her. Eveline Mae was thinner than memory could allow, clothes worn, face hollowed by sorrow. When she lifted her gaze to his, there was no surprise, only the dull shadow of shame, as if she had long expected judgment to arrive. Caleb dismounted slowly, removed his hat, and spoke low. "Your children wait for you." Her eyes filled, tears spilling fast as she pressed her hands to her face. "I lost more than a husband," she whispered. "I lost myself. When I was carrying Jonah, I thought I had the strength, but grief stripped me bare. I wanted to return. My feet carried me close, but shame stopped me at the door." Caleb stood still, letting her words hang heavy in the morning air. He thought of Lydia's hand slipping into his, of Jonah's soft breath against his chest, of the wildflowers brightening his table. His voice carried quiet conviction. "Maybe the world was too small for you then. Maybe what you lost is waiting at my hearth." Her hands lowered slowly, disbelief in her eyes. He extended his hand, rough and steady, not demanding but offering. For a long moment she wavered, torn between despair and a fragile ember of hope. Then her fingers brushed his, testing the truth of it. The ride back across Highwind Prairie was silent but charged with possibility. Eveline sat behind him, clutching the saddle, while Caleb kept his gaze fixed on the horizon. As Whitlock cabin came into sight, the door flew open. Lydia ran out, Jonah in her arms. Her cry split the evening air, filled with relief and longing. "Mama!" Eveline fell to her knees, gathering both children, weeping against their hair. Lydia clung tight, pressing her face into her mother's dress, while Jonah gurgled, reaching tiny fists toward her. Caleb stood a step back, throat tight, but he let the moment belong to them. Later, when the children slept wrapped in quilts, Eveline turned to him, her eyes rimmed with tears. "I do not deserve their forgiveness, nor yours." Caleb shook his head. "Deserve has little to do with it. What matters is the road ahead." She swallowed, her voice a whisper. "Do you mean there is a place for me here?" Caleb met her gaze, steady as the land itself. "There already is." The fire cracked between them, throwing warmth into the silence. Outside, Highwind Prairie stretched endless under the rising stars. In her sleep, Lydia stirred, reaching out even in dreams. Her small fingers brushed her mother's hand, clinging without thought. Caleb leaned back, watching the fragile bond knit itself again, and he knew the story was not finished. With reunion came new trials. Mercy was never granted without cost. The cabin itself seemed changed after Eveline's return. Where once the space had pulsed with quiet ritual bread broken, fences mended, fire tended, it now beat with the awkward rhythm of reunion. Lydia clung to her mother's side, her hand never far from the worn fabric of Eveline's dress. Jonah curled toward his mother's chest, recognizing her scent with instinctive need. Eveline's face glowed with joy shadowed by guilt, every smile lined with the memory of absence. Caleb gave them space, stepping back as though the walls of his own home belonged more rightly to them than to him. He watched Eveline move through the cabin, hesitant at first. Then, with growing ease, she stirred beans over the fire. Her motions slow but sure, and hummed the same lullabies Caleb had once heard whispered from Lydia's lips in the dark. For the first time, the cabin seemed to answer not only with the warmth of flame, but with the presence of family. And yet, beyond the walls, the prairie carried rumors like dry leaves waiting to stir again. Caleb Whitlock had grown used to silence filling Whitlock cabin, but since Eveline Mae returned, the air carried a different weight. At first, she moved through the rooms like a guest, careful, hesitant, but slowly her hands remembered the work of survival. She stirred beans over the fire, patched shirts at the table, tended hens in the yard. The same lullabies Caleb once heard whispered from Lydia Mae now drifted from Eveline's lips, softening the corners of the cabin in ways even the fire could not. For the first time, the place seemed to breathe with more than just warmth from the stove. Yet, outside their walls, Highwind Prairie carried talk like leaves scattered by wind. In Dry Creek, tongues wagged. Some said Eveline was a woman unfit for grace, a mother who had abandoned her children. At Dry Creek Chapel, stares lingered longer than prayers. Caleb bore it without complaint, though he saw the way Eveline flinched at each cut and glance. One neighbor was bold enough to sneer aloud as they passed. Some stains never wash clean. That night, while the wind beat against the shutters, Eveline sat hunched near the fire, her hands trembling in her lap. Caleb sat across from her, carving wood, his knife steady. Without looking up, he said, "No woman should carry shame for being weary. Dust rises, but it settles, so do we." Her eyes lifted, fragile as glass. "Do you mean this home can hold me, too, not just them?" Caleb set the knife aside and met her gaze. "It already does." Her shoulders shook with silent tears. She turned away. But Lydia, half asleep on the rug, reached out and pressed her small fingers against her mother's knee, wordless yet anchoring her in place. Evenings found a new rhythm. Eveline folded herself into the life of the cabin, laughter sometimes breaking free in short bursts when Lydia spun tales at supper, or when Caleb, uncharacteristically clumsy, sloshed water at the pump. He found himself watching that laughter, rare as rainfall, and storing it quietly. The children noticed the shift too. Jonah Lee often quieted faster in Caleb's arms than in his mother's, something that made Lydia giggle. Once she tugged Eveline's sleeve and whispered with a conspirator's grin, "He is not so scary." "Is he?" Eveline blushed, but she did not pull away. Still, the world outside pressed hard. On market day at Dry Creek Market Square, whispers followed them like shadows. "Fool rancher," someone muttered. "She is only milking his kindness." Lydia stiffened, ready to speak in her mother's defense, but Caleb laid a steady hand on her shoulder. His silence was heavier than any words. Eveline, however, felt each insult pierce. That night, while the wind rattled the shutters, she broke at last. "They look at me as if I'm already buried," she whispered, voice shaking, like I should have stayed gone. Caleb's reply was simple, quiet but firm. "Then do not look at them. Look here." Her eyes drifted toward the table where Lydia and Jonah slept tangled together beneath a quilt, their small chests rising and falling with steady rhythm. Eveline watched them, something softening inside her. "They deserve better," she said. Caleb leaned closer. "They deserve you, and you deserve peace." Her lips parted as though to argue, but no words came. Instead, she pressed her face into her hands and let the fire blur her tears. Days stretched longer as winter edged closer. Slowly, Eveline began to laugh more often. The sound was hesitant at first, then freer, like water breaking loose after drought. Caleb noticed how her shoulders no longer hunched quite so low, how she began to hum when she worked, how Lydia clung less tightly to her, comforted by her steadier presence. One evening after supper, Lydia placed Jonah into Caleb's arms and turned to her mother with a bright smile. "See, Mama. He makes him laugh," and laugh Jonah did. His tiny fists bat in the air, his giggles echoing off the log walls. Eveline's eyes lingered on the sight longer than she intended. A whisper escaped her lips, barely audible. "I thought I had no place left in this world." Caleb looked down at Jonah, then back at her. His voice was steady as stone. "Maybe the world was too small. Maybe the place you lost is right here." Her breath caught. The fire snapped, sparks darting up the chimney. Lydia leaned against her mother's side, eyelids drooping, while Caleb rocked Jonah in calm rhythm. Outside, the prairie stretched vast, the night sky pressing close around the cabin. Eveline lowered her gaze, but between them hung the unspoken question whether she could accept the grace being offered, whether love could grow again in soil hardened by sorrow. Jonah's laugh, light but sure, filled the room. Eveline realized the answer might already be waiting. Winter crept softly across Highwind Prairie, frost etching the fence rails white. From the chimney, smoke rose in steady ribbons against the pale sky. Inside, the cabin glowed with warmth, stitched together by months of shared breath, broken silence, and small mercies. Lydia's laughter had become as familiar as wind at the door. Jonah, stronger now, filled nights with cries and giggles. Eveline moved with surer steps, though shadows still clung to her eyes. Caleb kept his hands busy with mending and carving, but each glance across the table carried something unspoken. The weight of choice lay heavy in him still. One evening, a knock came at the door. Reverend Josiah Boone stepped in, snow dusting his coat. He removed his hat, eyes kind yet sharp, and spoke plainly. Folks can whisper all they like, but a house is steadier with vows. If you mean to keep her here, best to say it before God. The words hung in the room, heavy yet true. Caleb did not argue. Eveline lowered her gaze, cheeks flushed, torn between shame and longing. That night, after the children had fallen into sleep, Caleb spoke to her near the fire. His voice was low, almost shy. "We have built a life already. Maybe it is time to give it a name." Her breath caught, and if I fail again, he looked at her, steady, without judgment. Then we will fail together. Mercy leaves room for second chances. The fire crackled between them, carrying warmth into the silence. Outside, snow whispered across the prairie, but inside, a promise had begun to take shape, fragile yet certain. Caleb Whitlock had told Eveline Mae that mercy left room for second chances, and in the quiet of Whitlock Cabin, those words found their shape. Their wedding was simple. No fine lace, no rows of guests, only the glow of a single candle, the steady voice of Reverend Josiah Boone, and two sleepy children curled beneath a quilt nearby. Caleb stood tall in his best shirt, boots polished though scarred by years of labor. Eveline wore her one serviceable dress, hem carefully mended, her hair pinned back with trembling hands. In that light she looked rare, not for silk or jewels, but for the courage she carried where shame once lived. The preacher's words rang deep, speaking of covenant, of a house built not just with timber, but with loyalty and love. When Reverend Boone asked Eveline if she would remain, her voice wavered but held firm. "I will." When he turned to Caleb, his vow came like stone carved into the earth. "I will." The children stirred at the sound. Lydia sitting up to whisper, "Are we a family now?" Eveline pulled her close, kissing her brow through tears. "Yes, my darling. We always were. Now the world knows it too." The days that followed brought sweetness, but trial as well. Barely a week into their union, Jonah Lee fell ill. Fever seared his small body, his cries thin and weak. Lydia clutched her mother's arm, panic flashing in her eyes. "Do not let him go." "Mama." Eveline nearly broke beneath the weight, rocking him with frantic hands. But it was Caleb who steadied them both. Through long nights, he walked the floorboards, holding Jonah against his chest, murmuring half-remembered prayers. Eveline knelt beside him, whispering old verses through tears. "Surely, with hardship comes ease," she repeated, a saying once spoken by her first husband, now a plea sent heavenward. Together they kept vigil, hour after hour, until at last the fever broke. At dawn, pale gold seeped across the window, and Jonah's breathing eased. Relief struck through them like a storm passing. When he laughed weakly that morning, Lydia clapped her hands, joy shining in her eyes. Eveline leaned against Caleb, trembling. "You carried us through." He shook his head gently. "We carried each other." That evening, when chores were done and the children finally slept, Caleb stepped outside with a small wind chime he had carved from scraps of wood and polished bone. He hung it on the porch beam where it caught the faintest breeze, its notes drifting across Highwind Prairie like a hymn. Eveline joined him in the doorway, her eyes shining. "What does it mean?" Caleb touched the chime lightly, listening to its song. "Storms will come, nights will be long, but silence will never swallow this home again. Each note is a promise. I will be here." Eveline slipped her hand into his, the gesture quiet yet certain. No crowd witnessed, no applause followed, only the soft cry of the prairie wind and the rustle of winter grass. In that moment, the world felt new, inside. Lydia stirred in her sleep, murmuring softly, while Jonah sighed content against the quilt. Caleb and Eveline stood beneath the stars, the cold night pressing close, but warmth gathered between them like fire on a long trail. It was not a mansion, nor silken gowns. It was stew simmering on the stove, a newborn's laughter echoing off log walls, the trust in a little girl's eyes, and the way Eveline reached for Caleb's hand when she thought no one was looking. And maybe that was how homes were truly made, not with grandeur, but with one small kindness at a time. The story of Caleb Whitlock, Eveline Mae, and the children is more than a frontier tale, it is a mirror for our own lives. It reminds us that even in the loneliest places, mercy can build a home. Caleb, a man who had grown accustomed to silence, found his life rewritten by the fragile trust of a child. Eveline, weighed down by grief and shame, discovered that forgiveness was not something earned by perfection, but offered through love. For those of us who have lived many seasons, this story speaks clearly. Second chances are not only possible, they are necessary. Families are not built by blood alone, but by daily acts of kindness, patience, and courage. A hand held, a burden shared, a word spoken gently in the night. These are the bricks of a lasting home. Life will always bring storms, illness, and the judgment of others. But, as Caleb said, dust rises and it settles. So do we. We can choose to settle into bitterness, or we can settle into love. For every heart, no matter how weary, there is still room to begin again. Thank you, dear friends, for sharing your time with us today. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like. Share it with someone who might need its message. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps keep these stories alive, bringing warmth and hope to every corner of the prairie.